She saw it. No one believed her. The court laughed. Her father turned away. Her betrothed was gone. The creature she described, they said it wasn't real. They said she was broken. They said she'd always been fragile. But a foreign king came. He looked at the woman everyone was laughing at, and he didn't laugh. Why was he the only one who believed her? The hall was full of laughter. Not the warm kind. Not the laughter of feasts or children or stories told by firelight. This was the other kind, the kind that has edges. The kind that fills a room so completely there's no air left in it, and the person standing at the center of it feels each breath like a decision she has to make by hand. Rosalind stood at the center of it. She was 23 years old, and her hands were shaking, and she had not slept in 4 days. And she had her journal pressed to her chest like armor. Which it was, the leather-bound record of everything she'd seen, written in the hours between midnight and dawn when she couldn't close her eyes without seeing it again. The transformation. The fur breaking through skin. The sound of it. God, the sound of it. Like green wood splitting, and then the shape of her betrothed folding inward and upward, and becoming something that had no name in any book she'd ever read. She'd written it down, every detail. 3 times, to make sure she had it right. She was holding that journal now, and the court of Aldenmere was laughing at her. My lords. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I am not asking you to understand it. I am asking you to send riders to the border. This produced another wave of laughter. Lord Casson, who sat third from the king's right hand and had never, in all her memory, said a kind word to anyone, covered his mouth with 2 fingers, which was the only concession he made to dignity. Beside him, Lady Vale had gone pink with the effort of containment. Even the younger courtiers, the ones who'd once brought Rosalind flowers on her naming day, had their heads bent together, shoulders trembling. Her father did not laugh. He was worse than that. He sat on his throne, old oak, carved with the hunting scenes that covered every surface of the palace. Men with spears and things with teeth, and he looked at his daughter with an expression she recognized and despised, and had been fighting against since she was old enough to understand what it meant. Pity, the kind that had already made up its mind. Rosalind. The king's voice was not unkind, which was its own cruelty. You have been under tremendous strain. Lord Brennan's disappearance is. He didn't disappear. She heard the flatness in her own voice and couldn't fix it. He transformed. I watched him do it. I wrote down the time, 3 hours past midnight, on the 6th night of harvest month. I wrote down the location, the eastern courtyard, the corner nearest the old well. I wrote down what I heard and what I saw and what direction he went and how long it took and... You were standing at a window. Lady Vale interrupted, and her voice was gentle, the way a knife going in, gently is still going in the dark, in the middle of the night. You'd already told us you hadn't been sleeping. I know what I saw. Of course you do, darling. The laughter that followed was quieter, almost sympathetic. That was worse. Rosalind's nails found the spine of her journal. She pressed until she felt the leather grain against her palm, sharp and real, and she held herself very still. She did not look away from her father. And her father, the king who had built his entire reign on monster hunting, on clearing the wild lands of everything that lived in them, on the glory of his border garrisons and his great spear carriers, looked back at his daughter and made his decision in the silence of 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, she felt the floor shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with the stones beneath her feet. She had been brought here to be believed. She would not be believed. She could see it happen before he opened his mouth. Perhaps, the king said carefully, you should rest. She heard the sentence as what it was, the end of her testimony, the end of her petition, the end of any possibility that this court would move on what she'd told them. She heard it as the sound of something closing. A gate, a book, a door. She became aware, in the ringing silence that followed, of something she hadn't noticed when she walked in. There was a man at the far end of the hall who had not laughed. He'd been there the whole time. She'd registered him in the way you register furniture when you enter a room, peripherally, categorized and dismissed. A visiting dignitary of some kind. She'd been too focused on her father's face to look at the guests. But the laughter had moved through the room like water, finding its level. And in the settling, she felt rather than saw the one place it hadn't reached. She looked. He was taller than the men around him, though he was sitting. Dark, but not with the darkness of court fashion. This was older than that, a quality of shade that seemed to begin at his skin rather than be applied to it. His hair was close-cropped, and his jaw had not been shaved in 2 or 3 days, and there was a scar that cut through his left eyebrow at a slight diagonal, pale and precise, as though whatever made it had been very specific in its intention. He was watching her, not the way the court was watching her, not with that terrible, fascinated pity, the way a room watches something small and wounded. He was watching her the way she watched something she was trying to understand. With focus, with, God help her, something that looked like respect. His eyes, she noticed, were a color she couldn't immediately name. Not brown, not amber. Something between. They caught the torchlight at the wrong angle and seemed, for just a moment, to shift. She didn't know why she held his gaze, but she did, and he held hers. Around them, the court continued its murmuring, its gentle laughter, its management of the embarrassing princess, who'd broken under the weight of her betrothed's disappearance. Her father was saying something about rest and healers. Lady Vale was agreeing. Lord Caston was already turning to speak to the man beside him about something else, something certainly more important, the hunting schedule or the harvest tax. And across the length of that long hall, in the torchlight and the noise and the terrible open space, her public humiliation had carved out around her. The foreign king, with the scarred eyebrow, looked at Rosalind like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know what he was. She only knew that when she walked out of that hall, because she was going to walk out, with her head level and her journal pressed to her chest and her breathing measured, he was going to be the only person in that room she didn't hate a little. She turned and she walked. Her heels on the stone were very loud in her own ears. The room they'd given her faced east, which meant she woke to light she hadn't asked for, falling across the pages of her open journal like an accusation. She lay still for a moment with her eyes open and let herself feel the weight of the night before. Not because she was a person who lingered in her own pain, but because she'd learned, slowly and at cost, that avoiding it only made it heavier. She had done the thing you were supposed to do when you witnessed something. She had told people. She had told her handmaid, who'd gone pale and said nothing. She had told the captain of the guard, who'd sent men to check the eastern courtyard and found nothing, because there was nothing to find. The transformation had taken Brennan over the wall, not through the gate. She had told her father's seneschal, who had listened carefully and brought her to the king. She had told the king, and now she lay in her east-facing room with the light making her journal bright and her throat, still raw from speaking clearly into air that had bent every word back at her, and she thought about the man at the far end of the hall. She'd asked her handmaid about him. Marin had known immediately. She had a gift for foreign dignitary gossip that would have been more useful in an intelligencer than a lady's maid, and she deployed it with the enthusiasm of someone who was glad to have something to talk about that wasn't the trial. Ulrich, Marin had said, the Alpha King of Ravensmoor. They call his territory the Grey Reaches. It borders the wild lands on the western side. He's been here a week already. Some kind of border negotiation with your father. Very private. No one knows much about what they're discussing. She'd paused. He doesn't talk much at court. Lord Caston tried to engage him in the hunting stories, and he just looked at him until Caston stopped. Rosalind had liked him for that already. She sat up now and pulled the journal into her lap. She'd written Brennan's transformation in 3 separate accounts, on 3 different nights, each one as precise and detailed as she could make it. She read them the way she always read her own writing, with the clinical eye of the person who knew what had actually happened, and was checking whether she'd managed to get it onto the page. She had. Every time she read it, she almost believed she'd imagined it. That was the thing no one understood, the thing she couldn't explain to the court, to her father, to any of them. She didn't need other people to believe her in order to maintain her own certainty. She'd kept the certainty alive with her own hands, by writing it down, by reading it back, by refusing the easier narrative. But the not being believed had done something else to her, slowly and without her permission. It had made her voice smaller. It had made her qualify things she'd seen with her own eyes. It had made her begin every statement with, "I know this sounds," and "I understand if you find this," as though pre-apologizing for her own accuracy might make the truth more palatable to the people who didn't want it. She closed the journal. She was not going to apologize again today. She dressed herself. Marin had left early for the kitchens, and she went down to the eastern courtyard, because she hadn't been back since the night, and she was tired of avoiding it. The morning was cold. Harvest cold, where the air had a particular smell. Damp earth and something woody, something that went past the nose and settled in the chest. She walked to the corner near the old well, and she stood there and she looked at the stones. She didn't know what she expected to see. She'd expected nothing, and she saw nothing. The garrison captain had been thorough, or thorough enough. If there'd been marks she might have pointed to, claw gouges, disturbed earth, anything, they were gone. She crouched down anyway, running her fingers along the base of the wall. "You're looking for evidence." She stood too fast and nearly lost her balance and caught the wall with one hand, turning. The man from the hall, Ulrich, stood 3 feet behind her, and she had not heard him approach. No footstep, no rustle of clothing. He'd simply appeared the way morning fog appears, and was watching her with the same attention he'd given her in the hall. He was wearing a dark traveling coat, the collar turned up against the cold, and his breath made small white shapes in the morning air. "How long have you been there?" she said. "Long enough to see where you were looking." His voice was lower than she'd expected. There was something at the bottom of it, a register that she felt more than heard, a quality that didn't quite belong in normal speech. "You were running your fingers along the base of the wall. Not the surface, the base. You're looking for a change in the stone." She looked at her hand and then back at him. "I don't know what I'm looking for." "You're looking for something that proves what you saw was real. Or something that proves it wasn't." She heard herself say it and recognized it as the first honest thing she'd said aloud in 4 days. "I don't know which I want more." He nodded slowly. There was something in the nod that wasn't agreement exactly, more like acknowledgement. Like she'd said something worth acknowledging. "You were in the hall last night," she said. "You heard the testimony." "I did. You didn't laugh." "No." She waited for him to explain. He didn't. "Why not?" she asked. He looked at the wall for a moment, the place she'd been examining, and then back at her. His eyes in this light were the color of dark honey, and she caught that shift again. The brief amber flare she'd seen across the hall, gone before she could be certain of it. "Because what you described," he said, "is something I've seen." The morning cold went somewhere deeper. "You've seen a man transform," she said. "Yes." "Where?" "In the wild lands." The words were simple, flat, like stones dropped into water, across the border. Rosalind looked at him for a long moment. Her journal was upstairs. She wanted it badly, not to write this down yet, just to hold it, to have the familiar weight in her hands while she thought. "They'll say you're humoring me," she said, "to be kind. I'm not being kind." Something shifted behind his expression. Not coldness, but precision. Like a man adjusting his grip on something. I have no interest in your comfort if it comes at the cost of accuracy. It was possibly the most useful thing anyone had said to her in 4 days. She felt it land in her chest like a coal dropped into cold water, the hiss of it, the sudden heat. "What are you doing at my father's court?" she asked. "Negotiating access to the border territories." "For what purpose?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "For the same reason anyone negotiates access to something they consider theirs." He said it lightly, but she heard it. She filed it away in the back of her mind with a small internal notation. Return to this, the way she filed everything. The habit of a woman who'd learned that details were the only things that couldn't be argued with. "Will you?" She stopped, started again. "I'd like to speak with you again. About what you saw. About the wild lands." "I know," he said. "You know I'd like to speak with you. Or, I know because you're going to come to the library after the midday meal," he said. "You're going to ask to see the border maps. You're going to want to track which direction your betrothed went. And when you get there, you'll find I've already pulled them." She stared at him. He gave a short nod. Something between a bow and a dismissal. Easy and somehow not unfriendly. And then he walked past her back into the palace, and she watched him go. And she realized she hadn't heard his footsteps on the stone even now. He had already pulled the maps. She found them spread on the largest table in the library, weighted at the corners, with the kind of unthinking precision that belongs to someone who works with maps often, and Ulrich was leaning over them with his forearms on the table, and his head, tilted, studying the eastern border with the concentration of a man reading a letter rather than a geography. She sat across from him without ceremony. "Here," she said, and pointed. "The eastern courtyard of the palace is here, so if he went over the eastern wall and continued on that heading." She traced the line with one finger, not touching the map, hovering just above it. He'd have reached the border in perhaps 4 hours at a run. "At a human run," Ulrich said, "or at a wolf run." The word dropped between them like a coin on stone. She didn't flinch, but she felt something in her solar plexus react to it. Recognition, she thought, the bodily feeling of a thing being named correctly for the first time. "Is that what he is?" she asked. "A wolf? Is that what you saw?" "I saw." She pressed the edge of her thumbnail against her own palm, hard, as she did when she was thinking carefully. "I saw something large. Something dark. The proportions were wrong for a man, but the eyes." She stopped. "The eyes were the same. That's how I knew it was him. The eyes didn't change." Ulrich had gone still. She noticed it. She had a talent for noticing stillness in other people. It was perhaps what came of being dismissed so often. She'd learned to read the language of attention in fine gradations. "You saw his eyes," he said. "Yes, through the transformation. It happens quickly, and then it's done. He." She organized her words carefully. "He was there, and then he wasn't, and then the other thing was there, and then it ran, and I." She exhaled. "I went downstairs and I told the night guard that something large had gone over the wall, and he should send riders after it. And he looked at me the way they all look at me, and I went back to my room and I wrote it down. How many times? 3. Different nights. Same account each time." Ulrich's gaze moved to her hands. She was holding the journal. She'd brought it this time, held it in her lap under the table, but she'd taken it out without thinking while she talked. "May I see it?" She looked at him. She had not let anyone read the journal. Not because it was private in the way a diary is private, but because showing it to someone who was going to dismiss it felt like handing them a weapon. She'd shown the court her evidence, and they'd used it as another proof of her instability. The obsessive documentation, the 3 accounts, the timestamps, the excessive detail of a person who wasn't sure of their own mind. But this man had not laughed. She set the journal on the map table and slid it to him. He opened it at the first page of the Brennan accounts and he read. He didn't skim. She could tell by the pace of his eyes, the way he paused at certain lines and went back to reread them. He turned the pages slowly. He didn't make a sound. She watched his face. His expression was the same throughout. That focused, level attention, except once, near the middle of the second account, where something changed. His jaw moved, just barely. His brow shifted a fraction. She didn't ask what he was reacting to. She waited. When he finished, he closed the journal and set his hand flat on the cover and left it there, a gesture she didn't fully understand. "This," he said, "is the clearest account of a shift I've ever read." She felt the words move through her before she could stop them. There was a quality to being believed, she discovered, to being genuinely believed, not managed and not humored. That was different from what she'd imagined in the 4 long days of hoping for it. It was smaller, quieter. It sat in her chest without announcement. Her eyes stung, very slightly. She looked at the map. "The wildlands," she said. "What actually lives there?" "Not monsters," he said. "What then?" "People," he said, "who are also other things." She absorbed this. Outside the library window, the palace grounds were doing their morning business. Somewhere a horse was being reshod, the metallic ring of it distant and methodical. A kitchen maid was crossing the yard with a covered basket. "You've been there," Rosalind said. "Yes. Often?" He picked up the journal again and held it out to her. The gesture was clean and direct. "Here is your thing. I'm done with it. I want you to have it back." "I know the wildlands better than your father's best cartographer," he said. "His maps are wrong in 4 places I can see from here." He tapped the eastern section of the border document with one finger. "This river doesn't run that way, and this, a second tap, is not an empty valley. It hasn't been empty in 100 years. What's there now?" The answer wasn't immediate. He looked at the map for a moment longer. "If you want to find your betrothed," he said, "you would need to cross the border. My father won't allow it." "Your father," he said, "has been glad to be rid of the embarrassment of your testimony. If someone offered to take the embarrassing princess across the border to search for her missing lord, I think you'd find him very willing to grant permission." The word embarrassment landed without apology, and she understood he was using it precisely, not as a wound but as a fact. He'd said he had no interest in her comfort if it came at the cost of accuracy. She held that sentence, turned it over. "You're offering to take me," she said. "I'm offering to take you." "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because what you saw was real. Because the court is wrong and you are right. And because," he paused. And in the pause, something passed through his expression. That was different from the precision she'd been watching. Something that came from further inside. Because there are things in the wildlands that deserve someone who will look at them and tell the truth about what she sees. Rosalind thought about being laughed at, thought about her father's face, the pity in it, the decision made before she finished her sentence, thought about writing the same account 3 times to make sure it held. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow," he said, "before the court decides to find another use for your time." She reached out and put her hand on the borderline of the map. Her finger rested on the edge of the known territory, at the invisible line where Aldenmere stopped and the wild lands began. "All right," she said. Her father said yes inside of an hour. She'd expected more resistance. She'd expected to have to argue, to provide assurances, to manage his concern or his pity or his doubt. Instead, when she went to him with the proposal that the Alpha King of Ravensmoor had offered to escort her across the border, with a garrison escort, to search for Brennan and bring back whatever evidence could be found. Her father had looked at the foreign king standing behind her left shoulder and then back at her and said yes. She understood, in the way she always understood things she wasn't supposed to, quickly, quietly, before anyone told her, that the court was glad to see her go. She packed light. Her journal, the one, and a second blank one she'd been saving. Ink and 4 pens, wrapped in cloth. A traveling cloak she'd had since she was 17 that was too large across the shoulders and perfect in every other way. The knife she kept in her boot, which no one at court knew about, because it had never been relevant information in a palace. Marin helped her bundle it all, and cried quietly and said nothing useful. And Rosalind held her hands for a moment and told her she'd be back, and believed it about 80%. The rest of the 20% she spent examining. The horses were ready at dawn. Ulrich's people had their own mounts. 8 riders in the gray and black livery of Ravensmoor, quiet and efficient, with a manner about them that she couldn't immediately name. The Aldenmere garrison escort her father had assigned was 12 riders, led by a captain named Farron, who had the careful expression of a man who'd been told he was being sent to mind a person of limited sense. Ulrich arrived last. His horse was very large, black with a streak of white at the left foreleg, and it moved with him the way horses move with riders they trust completely. Not in the broken way, but the chosen way. He swung up without ceremony and looked across at her. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. And then, because she was trying to stop pre-apologizing, "I've never crossed the border, I know. Is there something I should?" "Stay close to me," he said. "Tell me what you see. When something strikes you as wrong, say so. Don't wait to be sure." She looked at him. "That's it?" she said. "You've been accurate so far," he said simply. "I see no reason to change the method." Something shifted, very slightly, in her chest, a small structural change. She turned her horse east. The wild lands smelled different. She noticed it within minutes of crossing the borderline, a line that was marked on no physical ground she could see, and yet she felt it, the way weather has a moment of shift before it arrives. The quality of the air changed. It was older, heavier somehow, not unpleasant but dense, layered with things she couldn't identify. Wet earth and pine resin and something metallic that wasn't blood, something more alive than blood, something she didn't have a word for. She lifted her head. Beside her, Ulrich watched her do it. "What do you smell?" he asked. "I don't know. Something I've never smelled before. I thought I'd smell." She considered. "I don't know. Rot? Danger? Everything we're taught about this place sounds like a warning. I expected it to smell like a warning. What does it actually smell like?" She thought. Like somewhere that has been left alone long enough to become itself. He didn't say anything for a moment. She heard him exhale. Not a sigh, more a controlled breath, the kind that manages something. "Yes," he said. "Exactly like that." They rode in silence for a while. The garrison men behind them talked quietly among themselves. Ulrich's riders were silent. She found herself listening to the silence of Ravensmoor's people and finding it different from the silence of nervous men. It was a comfortable silence, the silence of people who are where they're supposed to be. "Tell me about the transformation," she said, low enough that the garrison couldn't hear. Ulrich's gaze moved to the trees ahead. They were dark trees, closer together than the forests she knew, with a quality of watching that she recognized as her imagination and felt anyway. "What do you want to know?" "What does it feel like?" she asked. For the person doing it, a pause. "What makes you think I'd know?" The question landed with a particular quality, testing and honest at the same time, a door held slightly open. "You've seen it happen," she said. "You said so. You've seen it often, I think, from the way you talk about the wild lands, from the way your people move." She let that sit for a moment. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I just want to understand what Brennan went through." Another pause. This one longer. "Like coming home," he said. "The people in the wild lands would say it feels like that. Like a thing you didn't know you'd been holding releasing." She wrote that down in her memory. She'd write it on paper tonight. "Is it painful?" "Not once you stop fighting it." She caught the sentence and held it. "Not once you stop fighting it." "He fought it," she said. It wasn't a question. Brennan. He'd been fighting it. That's why it happened at midnight, in the dark, alone. He'd been fighting it, and he couldn't anymore. Ulrich said nothing. She read his silence. "He's not a monster," she said. "He's not what they think he is." "No," Ulrich said. "He's not." She looked at him directly then, at the angle of his jaw, the forward set of his shoulders, the scar cutting cleanly through his left eyebrow. His horse moved under him, and he moved with it, easy and entirely without thought, and she had a sudden strange perception of him in this landscape. He belonged to it the way a word belongs to its meaning. He didn't fit the palace the way he fit these trees. She knew then. She knew it before she was ready to know it, the way you sometimes know things that your mind hasn't finished building language for. She looked at the scar. She looked at his hands. She looked at the way he'd gone still when she said, "The eyes didn't change." She wrote the knowing into the back of her memory, carefully in the space behind her thoughts, and she decided not to say it yet. She would wait until she was sure. She would be sure before nightfall. They made camp at the edge of a clearing when the light began to go amber. The garrison captain set his people to making fire and setting the perimeter, his training overriding whatever unease he felt about the trees. Ulrich's riders moved differently. They spread into the wood's edge, with an ease that should have been strange for strangers to this territory, but wasn't. She watched them go. Ulrich built the fire himself. She sat on the far side of it from where she'd intended and watched him work. His movements had an economy she'd been cataloging all day. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. When he was done, he sat on the ground rather than on any available log or stone, legs folded under him, and opened the saddlebag he'd brought from his horse. He produced 2 traveling portions, bread, cured meat, something wrapped in cloth that turned out to be a hard yellow cheese, and set one in front of her without comment. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. She ate. The fire was warm, and she was more tired than she'd realized, the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes. She chewed and watched the flames and let herself not think for a moment, which was rare because she usually couldn't. "In the library," she said eventually, "you said the maps were wrong in 4 places." "Yes, you said this." She gestured toward the dark beyond the fire. "Empty Valley wasn't empty." "It's not. What's here?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. She had learned in the hours of riding that his silences were not deflections. They were load-bearing, the pauses of a man choosing words with intention, rather than defaulting to whichever words were nearest. "A settlement," he said. "About 300 people. They've been in the valley for 6 generations. My father's maps show nothing. Your father's surveyors didn't come here. Why not? Because they came to the border, looked at it, and turned back." His voice had no judgment in it, flat accuracy. "The wild lands have a reputation. The reputation is useful to certain people." She heard, "useful to certain people," and followed it. "My father's kingdom was built on monster hunting," she said. "Yes. If the monsters aren't monsters, then the hunting was something else." The fire cracked. A log shifted. She held the silence of what he'd said, because she needed to hold it, needed to let it become real before she could look at it directly. "Has he been hunting people?" she said. "His father did," Ulrich said. "And his father's father. I think your king does not ask what he's hunting, because not asking is easier than knowing." She thought of the hunting scenes carved into every surface of the palace, men with spears, things with teeth, the way the great hall smelled of old stone and older fire and the accumulated pride of generations of hunters. "He believed he was protecting people," she said, "not defending, processing." "Yes, that doesn't make it." "No," Ulrich said. "It doesn't." She looked at him across the fire. His eyes were doing the shift again, the amber quality surfacing and then receding, like light changing underwater. She'd been watching for it all day. It happened in low light. It happened when he was very still. She was very still herself right now. "Who are you?" she asked, softly, not accusatory. The question she'd been carrying since the library, since the courtyard, since the moment he'd come up behind her in silence on stone that should have made sound. He met her gaze. "You know," he said. She did. "Say it," she said. "I think." He said, "You should say it." You've been thinking it since this morning. You've been building toward it the way you build toward anything, carefully, with evidence, making sure you're right before you commit. He tipped his head, just slightly. Be sure, she breathed. She thought about the silence of his steps, the way his people moved through the trees. The thing he'd said, not once you stop fighting it, and the quiet authority of someone who knew what fighting it felt like from inside. The eyes that shifted in low light. The maps he knew better than any human cartographer. You're like Brennan, she said. You're she found the word he'd used, a shifter. The word sat between them. She'd said it aloud for the first time, and the world didn't end. Not like Brennan, he said. Brennan is young and untrained, and he's been trying to be something he isn't his entire life. But yes. He held her gaze. I'm a shifter. I'm what your father's stories call a monster. She looked at the scar through his eyebrow. The hands that had pulled the border maps to the right table before she arrived. She thought about him standing in a court that was laughing at her, and not laughing. You came to my father's court to negotiate, she said. For the wild lands, for the people in them. They're your people. A pause, a very particular pause. Some of them, he said. The ones in the gray reaches. And others, further east, who have no one to speak for them. The valley people. Yes, she breathed out, slow and controlled. Her hands were in her lap. She looked at them. I'm sitting across a fire from the thing my father has spent his entire reign teaching his kingdom to fear, she said. Yes. And I'm not. She stopped. I'm not afraid of you. No, he said. You're not. She looked at him again. He was watching her with the same focused attention he'd given her since the hall. And she understood now that it had never been the attention of someone observing something strange. It was the attention of someone who had been waiting for this specific woman to arrive. Not her specifically, but a person like her. A person who would look and say what they saw and not flinch from its implications. Brennan, she said. He didn't know this. Didn't know there were people like him. Communities. I don't know what he knew. He was trying to be a monster slayer. The irony of it settled, quietly devastating. He was hunting his own kind. Ulrich said nothing. He didn't have to. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the journal and opened it to a fresh page. The firelight was enough to write by, just barely. She uncapped her pen. Tell me about the settlement, she said. Everything. I want to write it down. He looked at her pen and her journal, and the particular way she was holding herself, leaning slightly forward, shoulders squared, ready to record. Something happened in his face. Something she wasn't sure she was meant to see. You're writing it down, he said, and his voice had dropped below its already low register into the frequency she felt more than heard. I write everything down, she said. You've seen the journal. You know this about me. I know. He paused. No one has wanted to write it down before. She looked up from the page. He was looking at the fire now, not at her, and his jaw was set in a way that had nothing to do with hardness and everything to do with the way a man holds himself when something has reached him that he wasn't expecting. She looked back at the blank page and she started writing. She slept better than she had in 5 nights. She woke with the gray half-light coming through the trees, and the fire burned down to coals, and Ulrich sitting on the same spot he'd occupied the night before, as though he hadn't moved. She was not certain he had. He was looking at the tree line, and there was something in his stillness that she recognized now as alertness rather than peace. A held readiness, the body of a person who keeps watch. She sat up and pushed her hair back from her face. You didn't sleep, she said. I slept earlier. He turned to look at her. You should eat before we ride. She ate. She was aware, with a clarity that was new, of the smell of the place. The morning version of it, which was different from the night version. The heavy pine and earth layering had lightened. There was something almost bright in it now, something that reminded her of water over stones. She lifted her head into it without thinking. Ulrich watched her do it and said nothing. I keep smelling things, she said, more clearly than usual. Yes, he said, carefully. Is that? She stopped. Turned the thought over. Is that the wildlands? Is there something about this place? He was quiet for a moment. There can be, he said, for certain people. She put that sentence in the back of her mind, next to, not once you stop fighting it, next to, some of them. The garrison captain was moving his men with the brisk efficiency of someone glad to have something to do. They broke camp quickly. She rolled her things and tied them to the saddle and swung up, and her horse moved under her with an ease that seemed, this morning, finer tuned than yesterday. As though the animal was more responsive, as though she was reading it more clearly. She shook her head. This way, Ulrich said, and turned his black horse toward the eastern valley. The settlement came through the trees before she was ready for it. She'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something small and hidden, maybe. Something that fit the word settlement, as she'd always understood it, temporary, marginal, the kind of place that exists on the edge of elsewhere. This was not that. The valley opened around them and she pulled her horse to a stop, without meaning to, her hands going still on the reins. It was a village. A full village, with the warmth of morning fires going in perhaps 40 hearths, the smell of wood smoke and bread, and something that was animals but not horses. Dogs. She thought, very large dogs. And the sound of it, the ordinary morning sound of people and children and work beginning. Stone buildings, most of them, older than anything she could date by eye. A well at the center. Vegetable gardens at the perimeter, late harvest brown now, carefully tended. People. People were looking at her, not with fear. With the careful attention of a community that had learned to assess newcomers without showing much. The way you learn to hold your cards when cards have been used against you before. They know you, she said to Ulrich. Yes, they're part of your. She searched. Your reaches. The gray reaches extend this far east. Yes, a woman was coming toward them across the central square. She was perhaps 45, with gray threading through dark hair, and the particular bearing of someone who has been in authority long enough not to need to display it. She stopped in front of Ulrich's horse and looked up at him. My king, she said. Then her gaze moved to Rosalind. Rosalind felt the assessment of it, not hostile, but thorough. Aldenmere princess, the woman said, not a question. Yes, Rosalind said. Rosalind. I'm looking for someone. The woman looked at Ulrich. He gave a small nod. Come down, the woman said to Rosalind. There's someone you should meet. He was sitting in a house at the eastern edge of the village, in a chair by a fire, with the particular hollowed quality of a person who has been ill or afraid for a very long time, and is beginning, only beginning, to remember that rest is possible. She almost didn't recognize him. Brennan had always been large, broad-shouldered, bright-eyed, the physical presence of a man built for the image of a hero. He was still large. But the brightness was different now, not dimmed, changed, more precisely. Like a lamp that had been moved from behind glass into open air. The light was the same, but the quality of it was freer. The lines around his eyes were easier. He looked, improbably, younger. He looked up when she came in, and she saw it, the recognition, and then the complicated map of emotions that recognition opened in him. Rosalind, he said. Brennan. She sat down across from him, in the chair the valley woman pointed her to. You look. She stopped herself before the reflex to make it easy kicked in. You look like someone who's stopped fighting something. He exhaled. It was a long breath. I'm sorry, he said. I know you are. I didn't. He stopped. I couldn't tell you. I didn't know how. I've known since I was 14. What I was. What happens when I. His hands moved on his knees. When I stop holding it back. I thought I could hold it back forever. I thought if I was good enough at everything else, you could make the rest of it not matter. Yes, she knew that feeling. Not the specific shape of it, not the transformation, the shift, the held and hidden self. But the core of it, The thing you know is true about you that the world insists is wrong. The thing you spend your whole life either performing the absence of or apologizing for. I saw you go, she said. I told them. They didn't believe me. He lowered his head. I know. I'm sorry. One man believed me. She heard. Behind her, the very slight sound of Ulrich standing in the doorway. Brennan looked up past her shoulder. The look between the two men was long and layered. She watched Brennan take in Ulrich the way you take in someone you recognize as a kind. You came back for me, Brennan said. To Ulrich. She did, Ulrich said. I brought her here. Brennan's gaze moved back to Rosalind. Something in his face had rearranged. She insisted, Ulrich added, and she could hear, just barely, the warmth that lived under his precision. I barely had to ask. Rosalind looked at the man she'd been betrothed to. This complicated, frightened, finally resting man who'd spent 14 years trying to be the kingdom's monster slayer, while the thing the kingdom was hunting lived in his own skin. And she felt the weight of all the ways this story was going to cost her. The betrothal that would have to be undone. The explanation she'd have to give. The proof she'd have to bring back to a court that didn't want it. We need to go back, she said. He looked at her. Not you, she said quickly. You don't have to go back, but I do. I have to. She thought of the laughter. I have to close the door properly. I have to make them hear. They won't, Brennan said. They will. She touched the journal in her saddlebag. I have something they don't expect. She spent 4 days in the valley. 4 days she hadn't planned on, but the valley drew time from her the way good rest draws exhaustion. Gently, without force, leaving her cleaner at the other end. She wrote constantly. Every person she spoke to, she wrote down. Every story she heard about the border, about the hunting raids, about the generations of loss. She recorded it with the same care she'd given the account of Brennan's transformation, triple-checked, precisely dated where she could date it, marked uncertain where she couldn't. She ate with the valley people. Sat in their square while the morning fog burned off the hills. Listened to their children learn songs she didn't know. Ulrich was always somewhere nearby. Not hovering. He was not a man who hovered. But when she looked up from her writing, he was generally in her line of sight, and she found that she'd begun, without deciding to orient herself toward him the way a compass orients toward north. Not consciously, involuntarily. She'd be writing and look up and find him, and feel, very specifically, the relief of knowing where something was. On the 3rd day, she asked him to walk with her to the valley's eastern edge, where the tree line thinned and you could see the hills that eventually became the gray reaches proper. She didn't have a specific reason. She just wanted the company, and that was something she would have questioned 4 days ago. Wanting company without a purpose for it, and now just accepted. They walked in the comfortable silence she'd learned was his preferred mode. What is it like? She asked finally. The shift. I described it, he said. Coming home. I know. She turned her face toward the hills. I mean, what is it like now, to do it here, in these lands, rather than wherever you spend the rest of your time? He looked at the hills. Different, he said. The places that know what you are. He paused. They receive you differently. You can feel it. When you're in a place that has never had to hold anything like you, there's a resistance. Not malevolence, just unfamiliarity. This place knows me. She thought about that. I've been smelling things, she said again, more clearly. And hearing. The night before last, I heard an owl, and I could hear where it was almost exactly. And I was in the dark, and it was 50 yards away in the trees. And I don't think I should have been able to do that. The pause that followed was different from his usual pauses. Rosalind, he said, something in the way he said her name. It was the first time he'd used it, she realized. In all these days, he'd said you and her and once, in the valley, when speaking to the elder woman, the princess. Never her name. Tell me something, he said. Your mother. What do you know about her? She blinked. My mother died when I was 4. I barely. She stopped. Why? Your father married a woman from the eastern provinces, he said. Near the border. Yes. Something cold and electric moved through her. Ulrich. I don't know, he said immediately. I'm not certain. But the eastern provinces, the ones nearest the border, have been home to shifter families for a very long time. Not everyone from there carries the bloodline, but some do, and some don't know they carry it. She turned and looked at him. The hills were behind him, and the light was going late afternoon amber, and his eyes had shifted. Fully this time, the amber deep and clear, and she understood that he'd stopped managing it, that he was letting her see. She felt it. She had been feeling something, some pull, since the courtyard, since the library, since the moment she'd first looked across the laughing hall and found him not laughing. She had filed it carefully in the category of to be understood later. Because she was a person who understood things methodically, who didn't rush ahead of her evidence. She wasn't sure she could file this anymore. The heightened senses, she said. The smell when we crossed the border. The way I've been feeling in this valley, like, she searched, like my own skin fits differently. Yes, he said, I could be a shifter. It's possible. A late waking. It happens sometimes, when the blood is mixed and quiet, when someone lives entirely within walls, when everything about the life they're given suppresses the other self. She thought about the palace, about growing up inside stone and court protocol and the shape of a princess, which had so little room in it for anything ungoverned, about being too loud and then being too quiet and trying to take up exactly the right amount of space for years and years. About the moment she'd seen Brennan transform and felt, beneath the shock, something she'd refused to name. She'd felt recognition. I don't know what to do with this, she said. You don't have to do anything with it yet. I have to go back, she said. I have to go back to the court and… Yes, he said, and you will, and then you'll come back here, he said it simply. A statement of fact rather than a request. She looked at him. The pull she'd been carefully not naming stretched tight between them, and she didn't name it now either, because they were standing in a valley where she'd just turned her entire understanding of herself on its axis, and there was a court she had to face, and a betrothal to dissolve, and a king to confront. Her father, who'd looked away, and she did not have room to name it yet. But she also didn't look away. She held the pull like she was holding a coal, carefully, with both hands aware of the heat. Tell me, she said, what I'll need to say. To make them listen, and he told her. They rode back in 2 days. Different from the journey out. They were the same people, and the ground was the same ground, but the quality of the ride was different, charged with something that had no name in the court's vocabulary. She rode with her journal open on the saddle, adding to it as she went, the pen moving in the rhythm of the horse. Her account, her proof, all of it dated and detailed and verified against Ulrich's knowledge and the testimony of 17 Valley residents she'd spoken to by name. The garrison captain, Farron, rode near her on the second day with the expression of a man who had gone looking for one truth and found something considerably larger. My lady, he said, what happens when we return? I'm going to tell the court what we found, she said, and He stopped. He'd seen enough of the valley, enough of its people to know what he was asking. The people in the wild lands. They're going to need protection, she said. Not from monsters, from my father's hunting parties. Farron rode in silence for a while. I have 12 men, he said at last, who saw what I saw. She looked at him. Tell me what you need us to say, he said. When we stand in the hall, tell me what you need from soldiers who were wrong about what they thought they were fighting. She felt something loosen, somewhere behind her sternum. The truth, she said. Just the truth. That's all I've ever needed anyone to say. Farron nodded. He was not a demonstrative man, she'd gathered that. But he nodded with a gravity that meant something. They rode on. At the border, she stopped her horse. Ulrich pulled up beside her and waited. The palace was a day's ride ahead. The wild lands were a day's ride behind. She was at the line between them, in the damp grass smell of no man's land. And she was certain she could feel now, with a certainty that had nothing to do with wishful thinking, and everything to do with the same clarity that had let her see Brennan through the dark. The pressure differential between the two worlds. "What do I say?" she said. Not about the court. About herself to herself, the question she'd been carrying since Ulrich said, "Some don't know they carry it." "You don't have to say anything yet," he said. "Not even to yourself. But eventually, he looked at the line of the horizon. You've been naming things your whole life that no one else would name. You'll name this one too, when you're ready." She breathed. The smell of the wild lands was still with her, even here. Or maybe it was in her now. The pine and the depth and the something alive and metallic that she'd never been able to name. She thought she might carry it with her across the border, and all the way back to the hall, and into the standing before people who had laughed at her, and through everything that had to happen next. She thought it might be company. "I'll come back," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him, one clear look, the kind that means something, the kind she would write down later, and then she turned her horse toward Aldenmere and rode. The court assembled in the great hall. Not voluntarily, her father had summoned them, perhaps hoping to manage the return quietly and keep whatever the expedition had produced in controlled hands. But these things have a way of spreading, and by the time the doors opened and she walked in, the hall was full. Every familiar face, every person who'd laughed. She carried the journal in one hand. She didn't press it to her chest this time. Ulrich was 3 steps behind her, to her left. The garrison captain Farron was behind him. 12 soldiers at his back. She heard them enter, heard the shift in the room's sound as the people who'd been watching her saw them following. Her father was on his throne. She stopped in the center of the hall, the same spot she'd stood before, and she looked at the court and she breathed. 4 weeks ago, she said, I stood in this room and told you what I saw. You told me I was wrong. You told me I was unstable. You told me I was imagining things. No one laughed. She could hear herself very clearly. I was not imagining things. She opened the journal to the first page of the Brennan accounts and held it up. Not for them to read, the distance was too great. For the gesture. For what it meant to hold it open rather than clutched. What I saw on the 6th night of Harvestance month was a man transforming. My betrothed, Lord Brennan, is a shifter, a person with a second nature that your kingdom has spent 3 generations calling a monster. He is alive. He is well. He is in the wild lands, which are not wild at all but home, to a settlement of 300 people who have been living there for 6 generations, while your maps called them nothing. The silence was a different kind now, not the silence before laughter. The silence before a room changes its mind. The wild lands, she said, are not empty. They are not enemy territory. They are home to people who shift, who have a second nature the way I have a left hand and a right hand, and who have been hunted for that nature by this kingdom under the flag of monster slaying. Her voice was steady. She did not shake. She had written this account too many times to shake telling it. I have their testimonies. I have dates, names, and records of 17 separate incidents of border incursion by Aldenmere's garrison forces. I have the account of a garrison captain who went looking for monsters and found children. Farron's voice came from behind her. Confirmed, he said, flat and clear. 12 men behind him, silent, standing. She looked at her father. He had gone very still. You told me to rest, she said, not cruelly, as a fact. You told me I'd been under strain. You looked at your daughter's testimony and you chose the easier story, because the easier story let you not change anything. She held his gazes. I understand why. I understand you have built everything on the other story. I understand that being wrong at the scale of a reign is not a small thing. A pause. Into the silence. I need you to be wrong, she said. I need you to be wrong publicly, and correctly, and with enough force to stop what comes next, because Aldenmir's garrison will go back to those woods. That's what they're trained to do. And if you send them back—" She stopped herself, felt the clarity of what she was saying, continued, "You will not be hunting monsters. You will be hunting people." Lord Casson moved. She saw it, the slight shift of his body, the intake of breath that meant he was about to manage this situation, to find a narrative that let the room off the hook. Ulrich spoke before Caston could. "Lord Caston," he said. His voice was very level and very quiet, and it carried perfectly because his voice had always carried perfectly. "The Alpha King of Ravensmoor holds a treaty with every major kingdom on this border. That treaty specifies conditions under which I withdraw all cooperation on trade, passage, and military support. Among those conditions is an explicit prohibition against the hunting of shifter communities in the territories under my protection." He paused. "The Eastern Vassal is under my protection." Casson's mouth closed. Ulrich looked at the king on the throne. "Your Majesty, your daughter did not return with a theory. She returned with evidence, 12 witnesses, and an international incident that I'm choosing at this moment to forestall. A pause so precise it was almost a blade. I suggest this court listen to her." She looked at her father. Her father looked at her. He was a man who had built his whole reign on a story that she had come back holding in ruins, and she watched him understand that, and she watched him weigh it. The cost on one side, the cost on the other. And his daughter standing in the center of his hall with 12 soldiers behind her, and a foreign king at her back, and an open journal in her hand. She did not help him. She waited. He stood up from the throne. "Lord Caston," the king said, "order the garrison withdrawn from the eastern border." He paused. "And send for the senior cartographers. We need new maps." The afternoon dragged long and courtly and procedural. There were 100 administrative questions that came after, the machinery of a kingdom being told to change direction, grinding slowly through the turn. She answered everything. She was precise. She did not once qualify her own account or soften its edges. It was only when the hall had thinned to the people, who'd stayed to ask genuine questions rather than challenge ones, that she let herself breathe from somewhere deeper. Ulrich was beside her. He'd been there the whole afternoon, not intervening. The intervention had been one sentence and then silence, the exact economy she'd come to expect from him. But present, which was its own kind of thing, the last courtiers filed out. The candles had burned down to half. The stones underfoot smelled of cold and old fires and the history of everything the hall had held. She was alone with him and the quiet. "You didn't have to speak," she said. "I had them. I know you did." He was looking at the throne, now empty. Caston would have delayed it. I shortened the delay. By about 6 months, I'd estimate. Yes. The corner of his mouth moved. "You would have managed it eventually." "I know." She looked at the journal in her hands. She'd been holding it for hours, and her grip had left indentations on the leather that she could feel with her thumb. She ran her thumb across the marks. "What happens now?" she asked. "What do you want to happen?" She thought about it honestly, not the diplomatic answer, not the one that managed everyone's expectations, but the real one. "I want to dissolve the betrothal properly," she said. "Brennan deserves to be released from it, not just abandoned. It should be done correctly." A beat. "I want to go back to the valley." "Yes, I want to." She paused. "I want to understand what I am." She said it without the apologetic prefix, without "I know this sounds" or "I understand if." Just the thing she wanted. He was quiet. "And I want," she stopped. She looked at him. He was watching her with the same focused attention that had been there since the hall. But the quality of it was different now. The precision was still there, but under it something else had come to the surface. Something she recognized the way you recognize a scent you've been smelling all day and only now name. "Say it," he said, and this time the word was softer. She looked at him, at the scarred eyebrow, and the honey amber eyes, and the hands that had set her journal back to her with such care, that had pulled maps for her before she arrived, that had built a fire and fed her and sat through the night so she could sleep. "You believe me," she said. "You've always believed me, even before you told me so." She held his gaze. "I want to know why, not," she stopped herself, "not what you knew logically, why you," he breathed. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked, not uncertain. That was too soft a word. Like he was meeting something he hadn't fully prepared for. "Because I've been in rooms full of people who look at something true," he said, "and choose the easier story. I've watched it happen more times than I can count, and you stood in a room full of people laughing at you." His voice dropped to the register. She felt as much as heard. "And you held the truth with both hands and you didn't let them take it." He paused. "I've been waiting," he said, "for someone who would do that." The fire in the sconces had gone to low gold. The hall was very quiet. She stood in the same spot where she'd been laughed at and felt the room differently than she'd ever felt it. Not as the place of her humiliation, not as the battlefield she'd returned to win, but as just a room. Just stones and old fire and history, and her in the middle of it, and the man who had believed her standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. She reached out. She pressed her fingers to the scar through his eyebrow. Light, just the pads of her fingers, barely a touch, and then she let her hand drop. "Come back to the valley with me," she said. "I was already planning to," he said. She laughed. It surprised her. It felt like something opening. "Of course you were," she said. He smiled. It was the first time she'd seen it, the real one, the one that reached the amber eyes. And it changed his whole face, made him younger, made him less like a king, and more like a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. She was going to write that down. She was going to write everything down. The sound of the laughter she'd been afraid of, and the sound of it stopping. The way the wild land smelled like coming home before she knew she had one. The scar and the shifted eyes and the warmth of a fire in a valley where the people knew they could rest. She was going to fill the second journal and then a third. She was going to go back to the border and learn what she was. Slowly, with the careful precision she brought to everything. But for now, she stood in the room that had laughed at her and felt it hold her differently. She stood in the ruin of the old story and felt the new one beginning, and she thought, "I knew what I saw. I always knew. And someone had said, I see it too." She kept the betrothal dissolution civil. She sat across from Brennan in the solar of the palace, 2 weeks after her return, and they talked for the first time as two people who were seeing each other clearly rather than through the lens of what they'd each agreed to perform. "You should have told me," she said. "I know. Not about the shift. I mean," she stopped. "I would have kept it. I would have been good at it. I am." She thought of Ulrich, and of the valley, and of what she'd started to understand about herself in the weeks since the wild lands. "I am becoming someone who understands this." He looked at her with something that was complicated and tender. "I know," he said. "I knew it that night, in the courtyard. When I transformed and ran, I was thinking, the thought I had as I went over the wall was that you would understand it if you saw it. And then I was afraid of that." He shook his head. "I was more afraid of you understanding than of you not understanding." She looked at her hands. "Because understanding would have changed things," she said. "Because understanding would have made it real," he said. "And I wasn't ready for it to be real." She sat with that. "Are you ready now?" she asked. "Getting there." He almost smiled. "The valley helps." She nodded. She knew what he meant. They dissolved the betrothal formally, before witnesses, and the court managed it with the careful efficiency of people who've decided to move on from an embarrassing chapter. Rosalind signed her name and watched the signatures dry, and felt nothing like what she'd expected to feel. Not relief exactly, and not loss. More like the clearing of a table. Space made for something that would actually fit it. She rode back to the wild lands on a morning when the first true frost was coming in from the east. Ulrich met her at the borderline. He was already there when she arrived, of course he was, sitting on his black horse with the white streaked foreleg, and he was looking east, and he didn't turn when she approached, but she knew he'd heard her while she was still a long way off. She was beginning to understand that about him. About herself, too. "You're early," she said. "You're later than I expected. I had to write the dissolution statement. It took longer then." She saw the expression on his face and stopped. He was not concerned about the statement. "You knew I'd come." "Yes. Were you waiting anyway?" A pause. "Yes," he said. She pulled her horse up beside his, sat with him in the morning frost and the smell of the border, which had its own distinct character, neither Aldenmere nor the wild lands, just the in-between, the space of crossings. "I've been dreaming about the trees," she said. "I know. You can't know that. I can smell." He stopped, and the thing that happened in his face was very close to what had happened by the fire the first night, when she'd said, "No one has wanted to write it down before." "I can smell the wild lands on you," he said, "even across the border. Even when you've been inside stone walls for 2 weeks. She felt that in her sternum. "Is that," she searched, "is that the bond? What you call it, the mate bond?" He was very still. "It can be," he said. "It isn't always. Sometimes it's proximity to the shift. Sometimes it's—" He paused. "Sometimes it's both," she breathed. She thought about all the things she'd filed away to return to. The pull in the library. The way the room had oriented her toward him. The warmth she'd felt across the fire that had nothing to do with the fire. "I'm not going to pre-apologize for asking this," she said. "Good," he said. "Do you feel it?" The pause that followed was not hesitation. She knew his pauses now. This was the weight-bearing kind. The one where he was choosing words that would hold. "Since the hall," he said. "When you stood in the center of it. I felt it when I walked in and saw you standing there with your journal pressed against your chest and the entire room laughing at you. And you were not." He stopped. "You were not breaking. You were furious. And you smelled like pine resin and ink and 3 days without sleep, and I felt it then." She looked at him. "And the bond," she said. "The mate bond. It's a recognition," he said, "not a command. You can refuse it. Some do. What happens if you refuse it? You live without it. And if you don't refuse it?" He turned and looked at her, and his eyes were the deep, full amber now, the shifted color, open and without management, and she felt the pull stretch taut between them, with the particular ache of something that has been held at distance and is finally allowed to close. "Then you live with it," he said, "which is different." She looked at the borderline ahead, at the wild lands beyond it, already calling, the smell of them in her chest like something remembered. "Take me home," she said. She hadn't meant to say, home. She heard it as she let it stand, because it was accurate. He turned his horse east. She rode beside him. She changed for the first time in the valley at the winter solstice, 6 weeks after her return. She didn't write about it. She couldn't. Not immediately. The thing that happened on the page the next morning, when she finally opened the journal, was not a clinical account. It was something else. Something that started in the middle of sentences and kept finding itself unable to contain what she was trying to put in it. She kept it anyway. She changed into something she would have to find language for, something that was larger and darker and smelled of night earth and pine, and she ran the valley in the dark with the full weight of her other self, finally loose after 23 years of weight-bearing, and the feeling was not what she'd expected. It was not terrifying. It was not monstrous. It was like coming home. It was exactly like coming home. Ulrich had been there. He'd been there the whole time, his large dark shape moving with her through the dark trees, and when she finally stopped, and the change reversed and she was herself again, her human self, kneeling in the frost with her hands on cold grass. He was beside her. and she was shaking with something that wasn't fear, and he put one large warm hand on her back and said nothing. She was crying. She hadn't known she was going to. She put her hand over his and held it there. "Why is it so?" she started. "Because you've been holding it for 23 years, he said. "And now you're not," she breathed. The cold air came into her lungs and she was aware, in a way she'd never been aware before, of exactly what her body was. Not small, not insufficient, not vessel of an unreliable mind, not the disappointing daughter who saw things no one believed. Something complete. Something that had always been complete, waiting inside the walls she'd built around herself. "I saw it," she said. Not about the transformation, not about Brennan. The thing she'd known about herself since she was 7 years old and had been told quietly and continuously was wrong. "Yes," he said. "I always saw it. Yes." She looked up at the solstice sky through the trees. She thought about the hall. She thought about her father's face, the pity in it. She thought about the 3 accounts in her journal, the precision of them, the desperate careful accuracy she'd maintained for 4 days in the face of everyone who'd told her to let it go. She thought about a man at the end of a hall who had not laughed. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with that expression she'd first seen across the fire. The one that was different from the precision, the one that came from further inside him. She moved. He was still on one knee from crouching beside her, and she moved and put her hands on either side of his face, and she kissed him, and he let out a sound she'd never heard from him before, something that went below language, something that belonged to the version of him that ran through dark trees and knew every creek in the gray reaches by scent. When she sat back, he was breathing differently. His eyes were full amber, no variation, and she could feel him working very deliberately to hold himself still. "Rosalind," he said. "Ulrich," she said. There was a long, particular silence. "I need you to be certain," he said. His voice was at its lowest register. "The bond is real. I won't," he stopped. "I won't have you choose this the way you were chosen for things your whole life, because it was arranged, because someone decided." She looked at him. "I'm the person," she said, "who wrote the same account 3 times to make sure it was right. I don't do things I'm not certain of." A pause. He smiled again. The real one, the young one, the one she was going to spend a long time with. "No," he said, "you don't." She wrote the winter as itself. Not as a metaphor, as a winter, cold and specific. With the pine trees going dark against early-gone light, and the valley. Fires burning long into the evenings, and the sound of it all writing itself onto her senses in a language she'd only recently learned she could read. She filled 2 more journals. She sent copies of the border testimony to her father with her own notation system. The one she'd developed in those 4 sleepless days when she'd needed her account to be irrefutable. Her father had sent a response, formal and careful, and the closest a king could come to something like acknowledgement. She didn't need the acknowledgement, she discovered. That surprised her. She'd thought she would. Had spent years imagining what being believed would feel like, building it up into something enormous in her mind. But when it came, it was simply correct. The thing that should have been true all along settled into its proper place. What she'd needed, she understood now, was not for the world to change. She'd needed to trust what she saw. She'd needed one person to say, "I see it too," and he had. The court learned to map itself around the treaty that Ulrich's presence enforced. The Eastern Valley got messengers who came and went without incident. Brennan, settled in the valley through the winter, began to teach the younger shifters what he'd learned in years of trying to be something else. The particular expertise of a person who'd spent a long time fighting a thing and had learned exactly where all the joints were. Rosalind wrote that down too. She wrote down the valley elder's name, Serena, and the way she'd looked at her that first morning, assessing and then deciding. She wrote down the children's songs she'd learned. She wrote down the smell of the border at dawn and the feel of the frost, and the way Ulrich made fire, and the sound of his voice when he was talking about something he cared about, which dropped below its usual register by half a tone and became something she could have navigated a dark room by. She wrote, "I was not imagining it. I never was." She underlined it once. She left the page to dry, and then she closed the journal, and she went to the door of the house she'd been given in the valley. And she stood in the doorway with the winter light coming in, at the angle it came this time of year, and she felt the wild lands around her the way you feel the place you're supposed to be. Ulrich was crossing the square. He saw her and changed direction without breaking stride, and she watched him come the way she was going to watch him come for a very long time. The scar through his eyebrow, the economy of his movement, the large hands that had built fires and pulled maps and held her journal like it was something valuable, because it was. He stopped in front of her. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Everything," she said, "as usual." As usual. She looked at him. "I'm writing what I saw, from the beginning. I'm going to write all of it." He nodded slowly, that weight-bearing nod. "All of it," he said. "All of it." She leaned her shoulder against the doorframe. "The hall, the laughter you, not laughing." She paused. "The border, the valley, the fire." She paused again. "The transformation." He held her gaze. "Which one?" he said. His voice was very low. "Both of them," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, the full amber gaze, unguarded, the thing he didn't manage anymore in front of her, and then he came inside, and the winter light fell across the floor of the valley house in long gold shapes, and she closed the door. There were stories after. The court of Aldenmere adjusted the way courts always do, slowly and with the particular dignity of an institution, pretending it had always known. New maps were drawn, the treaties held. The hunting party stopped crossing the eastern border, or most of them did, and the ones that didn't found themselves explaining their choices to garrison officers who'd stood in a valley and watched a princess write down 12 people's names. Rosalind became, without quite deciding to, the thing the border territory needed, someone who stood between them and could speak both languages. Not translate. She wasn't a diplomat in the way courts meant it. She was something older and simpler, a witness, a recorder, a woman who looked at the thing and said what it was and wrote it down 3 times and handed it to history and refused, absolutely refused, to apologize for her own accuracy. She kept every journal. She added to them for years. The shelf in the valley house where they lived grew crowded, the spines facing out in her handwriting, dates, territories, names, the account of the first change, the account of the second, and the third. The account of the day Ulrich stopped managing his eyes in her presence entirely, which she'd written down because she'd known it was significant, and she always documented the significant things. She wrote, "He stopped being careful about what I could see. I think that was the moment. I think that was when it became something with a future." She underlined it once. She did not add to the line after that, because some things are complete at the moment of writing them, and additional words only take from them. The court, eventually, learned the word she had given it. Shifter. Not monster. Not creature. Not the thing in the dark. A person who is also something more. She had said it first. She had said it when the word felt dangerous, when the word could have been one more piece of evidence they used against her. She had said it because it was accurate, and she did not make herself smaller for the comfort of people who preferred comfortable inaccuracies. One person had heard her say it, and had looked at her and had not laughed. Everything that came after began in that moment. In the lamp-lit hall, with the courts pressed around her and the laughter in the air like smoke, and her standing, and him at the far end of it, still, and her eyes finding his across the noise and holding. That was the whole of it. That was where the story began and where it returned, in all the years after, like a song that finds its way home. She was right. He believed her. And the world, which had been organized around the easier story for so long that it had forgotten there were other kinds, had to learn to hold the truth instead. It was hard. It was slow. It was entirely, completely worth it. Thank you for listening and for trusting me with your time tonight. If you're the kind of person who has ever stood somewhere and known what you saw, even when no one would look with you, I hope this story held something for you. Come back anytime. There are always more of them, and every single one begins the same way, with a woman who tells the truth, and a world that has to decide whether it deserves her. Stay close. There are more stories where this one came from, and I'll be here when you're ready for the next one.